communities can actually get involved in the game. And so community or public engagement in forestry, I think, has a lot to do with some opportunities for equity ownership, having a stake in the game. And I don't know what that looks like, because there's so many constraints around, the tenure system in forest management, for example. I don't know how you get communities involved in having an equity ownership, or indigenous communities. But I think that that's where the conversation is going in many sectors of our economy.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is with John Parkins. He is a professor and department chair at the Faculty of Agriculture, Life, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta, and he's a professor in resource economics and environmental sociology. Now, the sociology part is why I had him on. A little while back, I did a presentation for the Forest Industry Lecture Series here at the University of Alberta, and he was in the crowd and asked me a question about why I said something in the presentation I gave. And it was a very astute question, and I don't remember exactly what it was, because it was a while back. It was about back in December. But I remember it jogged my memory and thinking that I got to talk to this guy and get this guy on. And so I reached out to him. I wanted to talk to him about environmental sociology and how that ties into the sustainability piece, how it ties into forest management, and how it might shift the way we think about the forest and our relationship to it. And what knowledge does sociology hold, environmental sociology hold, that land managers should be thinking about, right? And so the conversation started off simple. We started talking about the definition of sociology. How does it apply to the environment and environmental management? And then we get into the nitty-gritty details of what does the future of forest management look like when you think about sociology and how our society interacts with different stakeholders and that kind of thing. And so it was an awesome conversation. Really enjoyed it. John was awesome. It was a short one, only about an hour. That just had to do with my time restriction, unfortunately. So I apologize for that. Right when things got juicy, kind of had to shut her down, but I think it was still a great conversation, and I learned a bunch. So you're going to love it. This podcast is supported by West Fraser, is the #1 sponsor for 2021. Without them, this would not be possible, and I thank them so much for their support. Greenlink Forestry is also a sponsor, again, doing great work in the forest industry, and I could not do this without them, so thank you, Greenlink. Finally, Damaged Timber. They sell damaged timber that you can put in your kitchen. To find out what that means, go to damagedtimber.com and put in Your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off. So without any further messing around, let's do this. Talking about environmental sociology with John Parkins. Here we go. I'm excited to talk about this because it's, like I said when we met up there, it's something that I feel I've been circling for a long time and never really hit on it, right? So this is going to be fun. So let's start off just talking about, like I said to you before, I always start off talking about why sustainability work, right? Why did you get into the environmental field? Why is it important to you? And how does it drive your passion?
Yeah. How did I get into sociology? How did I get into the sustainability work? I came to it after I finished my undergraduate degree, and I did an undergrad in business administration, but I never really felt entirely comfortable in that program. But I did go off to East Africa for 2 years, and I worked there, and it was a beginning of my career that I thought would be in international development work. And so from there, I came back to Canada, and I was looking for a graduate program that would allow me to further my career, to get the kind of education that would allow me to go back to an international country, East Africa or South America or other parts of the world where the development challenges are fairly acute, and to work in those countries towards poverty alleviation and rural development and community development and so on. So I realized at the time that a lot of the development challenges that exist in many of these southern countries are also in rural areas. So the majority of the population is rural, agricultural, a lot of small communities. And so I ended up at the University of Alberta in a master's program called Rural Sociology. And so I think it was less about me choosing me choosing sociology and more about sociology choosing me in a sense, because I just wanted to kind of gain some skills in international development, and it just turned out that a rural sociology program was a really good fit at that time. And so I ended up in the Department of Rural Economy at the U of A, where I currently work. We've renamed the department Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. But I did my master's degree there, and while I was there, I got to know some people at the Canadian Forest Service. And so after finishing my master's degree, I took a summer job at the Canadian Forest Service working on sort of social issues in forestry in Canada. And that really just led from one thing to another, where it turned into a longer term opportunity doing research in the social sciences. And then I went back to the university and started a PhD, and kind of the rest is history. So I became interested in issues around sustainability mainly because of my interest in international development. And then through my career, I started to realize that there were pretty interesting development challenges right here in Canada that I could focus on. And they were not entirely dissimilar to the development challenges in places like East Africa, right? Sort of community development, issues of poverty and poverty alleviation, and issues around trying to link the development of resources and agriculture to people's livelihoods and employment opportunities, and ultimately the sustainability of our communities. Mm-hmm. So that's really how I got into this, and I was fortunate eventually to find a position at the University of Alberta where I could continue some of my international development work, while also continue working in many of the Canadian settings that I started in after my master's degree.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. So classic, bright-eyed young man. I'm going to save the world. And this is where you ended up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Often talk about how, we often think that, we can, get out there in the world when we're young and, we can change it. And I guess I realized that, changing the world is a lot more challenging than we think, but we also can make our own little contributions in one way or another. And I guess I see, my own career and my own work in that way, sort of building on the contributions of others, trying to make a difference, in the lives of people, and trying to make the world a better place in our own way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's all we're all trying to do that in some way or another, right? Yeah. Awesome. No, that's good. Yeah. And especially to speak to your point about, to all that, that's kind of the truth about it all, right? Is that all of our problems stem, it seems like what makes them complicated is the social aspect. It seems, right? The science can be there and okay, this can do this if whatever, right? You can figure out the facts and how it can be done, but then the social, the political stuff comes in and all of a sudden it gets incredibly complicated and hard to navigate. So, but it's not something that I think most land managers really consider all that much. right?
Right.
Or even biologists or whoever, people in the environmental or sustainability world, maybe in the sustainable development world, obviously you have to consider these things, but so you're obviously in your world, it's your entire career, but like in forestry, we don't talk about it much. In the conservation world, you talk about it maybe a little more because they're worried about, how can we get this endangered species out there or whatever. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about how these things fit into the problems that we have, right? So let's start talking about, let's just start with the basics. And can you define environmental sociology for me? What is it? How do we separate it from everything else?
Yeah, okay. We can go back to sort of some basic concepts or definitions in sociology. So I think in order to really understand environmental sociology, we need to step back a little further into what we mean by sociology. So, what is sociology?
That's a good place to start.
Yeah. And, and how would sociology be different from, something like psychology, for example? So if we think about psychology as sort of basically kind of a study of individuals, individuals and their experiences, sociology is the study of groups, and group experience. And so that's where sociologists will look at a group such as a family system, so the sociology of the family, or the sociology will look at social movements, right? So how do groups of people form together to do something different, collective action problems, these kinds of things. So we might study environmental organizations, for example, right? Or other kinds of social movements like the labor movement. So sociology is interested in the study of groups. And what made sociology quite distinct as a discipline when it was formed, say 100 years ago, some of the founders of sociology started to use social facts or the social context as an explanation for social problems. And so when we say that now, it doesn't really sound very insightful. So for example, why does suicide exist, right? So let's use a very, serious challenge like suicide that many researchers have looked at over the years. And sociologists have studied suicide as well. And so prior to sociology, one of the dominant explanations for suicide was a religious explanation. For example, some kind of spiritual problem that possesses an individual, which leads them to a certain behavior, right? And then sociology comes along and says, well, wait a minute, it's not just, some kind of extra human phenomenon, right? It's actually a very human and a very social problem. So, the Durkheim, for example, when he was studying the suicide, was sort of explaining the rates of suicide within French society by looking at the individual, right? Males have a different rate of suicide relative to females, right? And so what is it about men in that society that causes them to be more isolated, that causes them to be sort of more prone, to this kind of behavior? And so explaining a social fact using other social facts, is a kind of feature of sociology. And then if you move along to the idea of environmental sociology, what we do is environmental sociologists are interested in the interaction between society and the natural world around us. And so we're interested in kind of going back a little bit, sort of backing away from explaining everything by looking at social facts to trying to bring in environmental variables or environmental factors into our explanation for how the world works. So for example, if we look at a concept like altruism, the way in which we, will kind of selflessly help other people, or are concerned, unselfishly concerned about the welfare of other people. If we think about what altruism, well, you might be able to explain that by social facts. For example, maybe people become more altruistic if they belong to a community that has a norm of altruism, like everybody around you is altruistic, so therefore you become altruistic, right? So that's basic sociology. But environmental sociology might be interested in the environment that person grew up in and what it was like as a young person. So maybe that family or that individual experienced a lot of hardship because of drought, right? Or maybe there was an environmental disaster like an earthquake, so sort of bringing environmental factors back into our explanation for sort of human behavior, for example. So that's environmental sociology fundamentally. But then if you sort of bring it forward to, what's more relevant or what we're talking about today in this podcast, environmental sociology in forestry, for example, looks a lot like trying to understand the relationship between society, which would be like forest-based communities, forest-dependent communities, and the natural environment, in other words, the forest landscape. So what's the link between forestry activities, and the sustainability of our communities? And so that's one of the examples of environmental sociology that has gotten a lot of focus within Canada over the last 20 years, for example.
Right. Yeah. It's a fascinating concept. So it kind of stemmed from psychology, and psychology kind of stemmed from philosophy, if I'm not wrong, right? So it's
I guess you could draw it all back, in history, and yet there are other threads of academic work, for example, environmental psychology or social psychology, that really blend, what we're talking about in different ways. So lots of psychologists are interested in people's individual experiences with nature, right? Or, how nature influences their well-being, right? Their emotional state, for example. So that's what we sort of focus on. And I guess, as an environmental sociologist, when you go back to your comment earlier that, a lot of people in the resource sector, forest managers, for example, don't often think about, some of these social contexts very much. Yet we also know that pretty much every problem we're dealing with ultimately is a social problem, right? And it's a social problem because it wouldn't be a problem unless humans came along and decided it was a problem, right? It's like, well, there's species that are disappearing, so we've got an endangered species problem. That's a social problem, right?
Right.
I mean, it's a social problem because we define it as a problem. And it's also a social problem because these species aren't just disappearing because they're, in conflict with each other. They're disappearing because there's a problem with their relationship to humans, right? So, and human behavior. So in a sense, all of the problems we're dealing with are social problems. And I teach a course at the University of Alberta on public engagement and conflict resolution. And one of the first things I talk to the students about is that, when you finish your science degree, you come out of the university, you've got a degree in science or a degree in forestry, and you're young and bright-eyed and enthusiastic about how science can solve all these problems. And to some extent, that's true. And I'm certainly a believer in science and what we can achieve through scientific methods. But students will quickly realize, especially when they move through those first few years in their career, they're going to realize that the biggest challenges they face is not finding the right science to answer their problems. It's actually going to be how to deal with the humans, right? It's going to be how to deal with conflict and competing views and competing claims, and the gridlock that is associated with that, right? So you ultimately are faced with, some of the biggest challenges in resource management, which are the social problems that we're facing. Yeah.
No kidding. Yeah. I think that's exactly, that exemplifies my reality completely, right? Like you kind of leave university, you're like, I got some things figured out. Like I can be a professional now. I understand the science. And I've said a few times on the podcast that I think for quite a while after I graduated, I was a bit of a scientific zealot in that I was almost ignoring the social or the other things in favor of the hard facts, right? Forgetting that this is a social world, and this, nothing's going to get done unless you understand the social aspect of it. So it's taken me until I'm 32 to kind of figure that out. But yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, the science kind of figures, like, we've kind of figured out how we should relate to the world, but what slows us down is exactly that, the disagreement amongst social groups about how exactly we make that transition or whatever, right? Like it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think if we push that conversation a little further, we can see that, it's a disagreement among social groups that is a challenge for us as resource managers. But even beyond that, it's disagreement between social groups who have their own scientific positions, right?
Right.
So one of the things, I talk about with my class at the university is that, I force them to read the first article they read in this course on conflict resolution is an article with the title that says, "Why Science Makes Environmental Controversies Worse." And so the point there is that a lot of times the environmental controversies that we're dealing with at the heart of it involve scientists themselves who are disagreeing with each other, right? And they're doing that because they are looking at different elements of a very complex world out there and measuring things in different ways. So let's just take an example. I've been involved in the forest industry over the last few years on the topic of ecosystem-based management, EBM. So I don't know if you've had anybody on the podcast who's talked about that, but
a few people.
There are people out within the Alberta landscape who have a very particular definition of what EBM means, ecosystem-based management and the elements of EBM. They have a strong scientific position on that. But then there are other people who also have an equally strong scientific position on EBM, but they have a very different definition and a very different understanding of what that looks like. Mm-hmm. So, for example, EBM in the conservation world, EBM looks a lot like protected areas, right? And limiting the harvesting patterns of forest companies.
Right.
Or the extent of harvesting of forest companies. On the other hand, the forest industry has a scientific basis and a definition of EBM that reflects the need for more harvesting, or more diverse types of harvesting patterns, for example, right? So these are often in conflict, and it's the social groups or the stakeholders who are in conflict with each other, but it's also their scientific perspectives. They have a competing scientific basis for their argument, and so that's what makes these conflicts often quite intractable, right? They're difficult to get past, right?
Absolutely.
So, and that's one reason why I find them so fascinating too. Like, if we could figure this out, we probably would have figured it out already, but some of these things are deeply problematic. No, we're not going to get past it very quickly. And that's what makes it interesting to look at, to study as a sociologist, and to really try to dig more deeply into where people are coming from, as stakeholders, what they're bringing to the table, where are the points of commonality within this big realm of conflict, and where are the opportunities to move forward together, right? That's one way we can sort of look at trying to resolve these conflicts over time.
I love that perspective. I think that's the way to do it, right? Because I think the commonality that land managers have, whether you're an NGO group or you're a forest manager or you're part of First Nations or whatever, we all want sustainable landscapes forever, right? And that means ecosystem health and everything. We all want that. And we're just disagreeing on how much of interaction with us is necessary to make that as beneficial as possible. And we're just and then you're right? Like the forest industry, a lot of conservation scientists will really go hard at the forest industry because their perspective is that less is better. But the forest industry also has, like you said, a lot of strong science saying that, well, no, this is, from our perspective, this is actually better for these values. And it's interesting, right? That we are arguing about very, like, the core belief is the same. It's just how do we get to there is different, right? And it's how do you suss that out? It seems yeah, the commonalities are important. I think you're right. Like, that's how you bring people together and start discussing this and say, hey, it's okay that we disagree on the specifics, but let's start talking about it. And like, if I was to reduce the whole thing down, I would say anytime you have two opposite ends of something, I'd say a middle approach is probably the way to go, if I had to guess, right? If you want to hedge your bets, right?
But yeah, for sure,
that's a very simplistic way of looking at it.
Well, that's I suppose that's one way we try to kind of move forward, is to say, okay, we're gonna put together a forest management plan that tries to split the middle, that tries to sort of carve a path that isn't entirely satisfying for any one group, but sort of meets the needs of everybody, roughly speaking. That's one way to go about it. I guess another way to go about it might be with more experimentation, right? And over the years, my colleagues have been saying, and I agree, that, at least in the social science world, in the policy world, we're just really fearful of experimentation, because an experiment could go badly, and then you get bad press, and things go wrong in the landscape. Nobody wants that, right? But on the other hand, if you take small pieces of land, or small areas with the groups who are involved in forest management, maybe you can do some experimentation. And we talked a little bit together in recent days about the idea of community forests, right? And taking a small area of forest landscape, and saying, okay, let's just try something a little different on here, and let's experiment with it. Let's just see how it goes, and that could be, trying to sort of use different kinds of harvest patterns or cut blocks in that area, and see what happens to certain wildlife populations, for example, or, a variety of different approaches like that one could use. Or, let's experiment with an approach that really foregrounds or sort of gives privilege to certain kinds of voices or certain values or certain communities. So maybe an indigenous community has been really kind of on the forefront of trying to do something different with a forest company. Why not give it a try in an area? Doesn't have to be the whole landscape, but maybe it's an area that is really focused on indigenous perspectives, indigenous values. Maybe it's related to fire management, for example. So there's lots of conversation these days around indigenous ways of managing fire on the landscape. Let's give it a try in some areas. Obviously, that's a pretty risky one to work with, but maybe there's some opportunity to move in those directions. And so, you're back to your point, we could try to sort of roughly manage and kind of find middle ground as an approach. Another approach could be to do more experimenting. So I think there's a number of ways we could pursue that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think experimentation thing, I think, is something that people are interested in, but industry specifically shies away from it because they're afraid of getting their hands slapped by the government when they try something out and it goes poorly. Yeah. Right. Because they have to be not free of consequences because they have to be held to a high standard, but there needs to be some autonomy to hey, we want to try and do a different way of doing this that hopefully is more ecologically sustainable or more sustainable for the other non-timber values, but we also need to be, we have to have the autonomy and the freedom to do that, right? And that's where something the community forest is interesting to me. I like that concept. So I wonder how much of that is just shying away from the experimentation because of the fear of social consequences.
Yeah, and I've heard this many times where people will say, the most conservative groups in the room are often the government folk, right? There's a lot of fear around experimentation from the government side, which is peculiar. It's obviously the buck stops with the government at the end of the day. If things go badly, I think it might look bad for them. But if we also set it up in a way to sort of say, hey, this is a small area of land, we're just going to experiment and see what happens. And if we get any indication that things are going sideways, then we're going to cancel the experiment and kind of go back to the other approaches. I was just thinking about years ago when I did my PhD. My PhD was in forest management topics in forest management, and I studied the public engagement process in forestry.
Oh, yeah.
So I attended public advisory committee meetings on a monthly basis. And these public advisory committee meetings gave me kind of insight into what the local advisory committee was doing and what kind of advice they were giving to the forest company. And, I probably can't say which company it was, but it was also a long time ago.
Yeah.
Like it's probably 150 years ago now when I did my PhD. So, so at that time, as an example of an experiment which just didn't go anywhere, but the advisory committee made a recommendation to the forest company in their forest management plan that they would like to see a set aside within the forest management area. This would allow for the measurement of ongoing baseline conditions within that forest landscape. So you have active forestry all around, and then you have this one area that's a large enough kind of set aside where nothing happens, and then you can compare, what the ecosystem is like there compared to these other areas over time. And the forest company was okay with this idea. They thought, okay, well, maybe we can give it a try, right? So they go back to the government with this forest management plan with a set aside in the middle of it. And the government said, no way.
Yeah.
So the company was willing to go with something different, right? Something that the advisory committee wanted to see. But at the end of the day, it just didn't happen.
Yeah, and ultimately the government speaks for the public, technically speaking, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so the government...
How accurate that is, I don't know, but...
Yeah, so...
Yeah, I suppose that is part of the problem, right? How do you get the government to accept something so exploratory, right? Especially like when you have municipal support and industry support, it's unfortunate that we can't do that. So, like, what kind of solutions do you see to that? Are there? I'm sure there must have been further research since then to try and explore opportunities and how to become more explorative. Do you know?
Yeah. So there's certain experiments in forest management within Canada that deal with, some of the social context of forestry. And, some of that has to do with linking communities more closely to forest management practices and the management of forest landscapes. So, one example of an experiment that's been quite successful in British Columbia is the Community Forests Initiative. And so community forests are all over the landscape. I think there's 100+ community forests in BC now. And these community forests basically have a long-term lease of Crown land that is around their community that they manage. And some of them are quite small, others are very large. And these community forests allow for the community through a local community board to manage a forest landscape based on the values of that community and what they want to achieve with that landscape, as well as based on the benefits from doing that accrue directly back to the community itself. So why would BC want to experiment with something like this? And it goes back to kind of a longer history of the challenges of community sustainability in the forest sector in Canada. So if we think about the forest sector being one of the primary sectors in the economy, agriculture being another, you can see in agriculture, for example, that there's been generally a depopulation of agricultural communities throughout Western Canada. For example, in Saskatchewan, at one time, 100 years ago, we had thousands of, or at least hundreds of, communities across the prairie landscape with a postal code and a grain elevator, and people living there and working in those agricultural landscapes. And that's really no longer the case, primarily because of the replacement of labor with technology, right? So you just don't need these large labor forces anymore in agriculture. And it's the same thing in forestry, right? So forestry has to compete internationally. They need to be efficient, and competitive as an industry, and they've done that. But as a result, you just get a smaller and smaller workforce. You get these super mills that pump an incredible amount of volume through a mill and employ a very small labor force. And so what happens is what I describe as the delinking of industry and community. So historically, the link between industry and community was so close that communities were carved out of the forest landscape primarily to just host individuals and families to live there, to work in the forest sector, right? So there used to be a very close, almost one-to-one relationship between the fortunes of the community and the fortunes of the industry. Now that's not the case, right? So you have the industry that is exporting more than it's ever done. The production side of the industry is strong. The export side is strong. But if you look at forest-based communities across Canada, they're declining, right? They're smaller and smaller. There are fewer and fewer people working in forestry. And so these communities are located in a forest landscape, but they don't necessarily derive any benefits directly from being in that forest landscape, right? There are no more good paying jobs. There are a few, but there are not many, right? So people have to find other ways to make a living. And so one of the solutions that BC has explored is this idea of forest communities, where communities can control more of that local forest landscape and can return the benefits of forestry directly back to the community itself, as opposed to those benefits going to the shareholder and the crown, right? So another way to think about it is that historically the social contract that we had with forest companies is, okay, you get to cut the trees around this landscape, but in return, you give us a lot of good paying jobs, right? That was the social contract. That contract doesn't exist anymore. So what does the new social contract look like? Okay, so one of the ways to think about this new social contract is that companies still get to cut the trees around the forest landscape, but communities get to have more of a say in what goes on in terms of managing their own forest landscape, right? Having some access to their own area where they can do things that directly benefit the community. So that doesn't necessarily translate into a lot of job creation, but what it can do is can translate into a stronger tax base for the municipality. It can translate into opportunities to invest in things like municipal facilities, schools, other kinds of infrastructure that help the community to survive over time. Gotcha. Right? So that's one example of what we could do, in the forest sector. We don't see that in Alberta very much, though, right? So
what's the hold up there, you think?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a chapter for a book on community forests in Canada, and my job was to write the chapter on community forests in the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. It was a very small chapter because there's really not very much to talk about. And, I guess, your guess is as good as mine. I think we were speculating. Partly, it's a newer industry in Alberta compared to BC. It sort of forestry became a dominant thing within the province, in the 1980s, 1990s. And so we just don't have like this deep culture of a forest, kind of a forest community or forest-based community the way they do in BC, right?
Sure. I see what you're saying. There's not the generational, my grandfather's grandfather was a logger and he was a logger
part of my identity, that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
In some ways, we have more of that in the oil and gas sector, I would say. And then I think also part of it is just Alberta's general view of the world, which is, I guess you could say, go big or go home, right? So we don't like to do anything small scale around here.
Yeah, we're the Texas of Canada.
Yeah, if it looks small scale, then somebody else can do it.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some of that.
Who knows?
And I think, it's also just the policy context. If you get the right people in government, the right people in industry, at the right opportunity, they can open a window. And that's what happened in BC. They opened this window in the 1990s, and there was a lot of fear about community forests. A lot of people said, there's no way this is going to work. This is a dumb way to manage forests. It's not efficient. It's, there's so many reasons why it's just not going to survive. Well, it did, right? Yeah. And it will, and it does. And so, so I think it's also just kind of a unique policy context or an opening, a window, and you either step through it or you don't, right? So,
yeah. No, it's an interesting conversation. I've been having this kind of discussion a lot lately, about the social context and adapting the forest industry to maybe ecosystem-based management or some such. Because forestry is always changing the way it does things, right? Like, it's not to say that forestry is not innovative, because it's constantly doing research and adapting how it does silviculture or how it does harvest to try and adapt to the new way of doing it. But there's a demand now, I think, to speed it up to an extent that the industry can't keep up with, right? And to do true ecosystem-based management, I think, is something that Gary Merkel said in the Old Growth podcast that I did, was that there's not a lot of foresters out there that really understand what ecosystem-based management is, right? And I think I'm one of those people. Like, I think I understand the concept, but I don't know what it looks like on the ground. What does it actually look like to have ecosystem-based management or community involvement, or to manage the non-timber values as co-values and not as constraints on the landscape, kind of thing, right? I think it's entirely possible, but it's challenging to visualize or understand, right? So I like having these conversations because it challenges our preconceived notions of what we should and can be doing. And like you said, they thought that the community forests are going to fail, but they've done really well. And I'm sure they've done good things for the relationship between the public and the industry, right?
Yeah.
There's been more transparency there, probably a little bit more of a comprehension of what industry does on the landscape, not just, the stereotypical view of the big bad corporation kind of, that kind of thing. So what kind of opportunities do you see, or what I should ask you is, what do you see are the social constraints in Alberta for something like community forests? In, let's say, like, one of the big problems that forest industry has right now is trying to figure out how to do indigenous consultation in a good way that's productive, right? What are the social constraints that you envision? Because I almost see, like, the reason it hasn't gone really well is because you have two cultures that don't really understand each other, and when they meet, they're not even talking the same language as far as the values that they're discussing, and that's kind of what's stopping progress. I don't know. What have you seen in your research?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. So if we take the assumption that we, through indigenous consultation or indigenous engagement, there have been efforts in that direction. We have indigenous consultation guidelines. We know through the history of the recent history of the court system that if you don't get the consultation right, you can get into trouble legally, and your project and your work can be halted or delayed or halted altogether. We see that in the pipeline context, but increasingly we see a need to have meaningful forms of engagement with Indigenous communities. And then the question is, well, what do we mean by meaningful, right? And how is that different than the way we've done it to date? And so so a lot of people I talk to in the forest industry will say, well, meaningful consultation starts with a meaningful relationship, right? So having relationships with people that are based on, some kind of trusting, a history of trust, an opportunity to work together, to collaborate on things that of shared interest and shared value, so there's that piece of it. But I think a more kind of radical look, I don't even know if it's very radical anymore, but is to put the whole conversation around Indigenous consultation into the broader Canadian conversation that we're having around decolonization, right? And we are, we're a country that has settled. We are all settlers. We've come to this landscape under a treaty agreement, and we sit on these treaties, and we need to sort of reflect on what that means, right, in terms of our long-term relationship to to indigenous and non-indigenous communities. And so for me, decolonization means that when we talk about indigenous consultation, we need to change the conversation from, what it has been historically, where, the powerful elements of society, whether that's, government representatives or industry representatives, get to decide how it goes. Right. And get to say how this relationship's going to work, and get to tell people what they can or can't do, what's going to be allowed, what's not going to be allowed. And
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, to put the relationship on more of an equal playing field. And so what does that look like? Well, I think that's partly where the idea of community forests come back into the conversation. What you get with the community forest is you get a community, and this could be an indigenous community in this conversation. So an indigenous community, if they have a community forest, then that means they have not necessarily the ownership, because it might still be Crown land, but they have control over what happens in that forest landscape. And then they can go to the industry and have a peer-to-peer relationship. They're on equal. They have a more equal playing field, where the indigenous community has direct control over what happens on that landscape, and the industry that wants to get certain kinds of values out of that landscape, right?
Yeah,
and then you can start to have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. That's something you said there that I wanted to just highlight. Was when we talk about consultation or indigenous engagement, you're right. I don't know how much, when it came to the guidelines that Alberta has, right? How much were First Nations involved in creating those guidelines, and how much was it industry that was involved? You know what I mean? Who had the say there? Who came up with those? Did First Nations were they even involved in that? I have no idea. I don't know if I'm asking a fair question. It may be unfair, but it sure does seem like you're right. They're a very unique part of our country that is often policies and regulations are laid on them without their consent, even though they are considered supposed to be an autonomous group.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know too much about how those consultation guidelines came about, but I know that some Indigenous communities are not on board with them, and so obviously, just like non-Indigenous communities, we don't speak with one voice. We don't all see things the same way. Some Indigenous communities are on board with the consultation process, others are not. But the trend that I'm generally seeing, and I think this is one of the points I'd like to really emphasize in this podcast, is that when we talk about consultation, I think that the goalposts are shifting pretty substantially right now. And I'm saying that as somebody who's studied consultation deeply, right, from my PhD work in the mid 2000s all the way to the present. And I think historically, even myself, what I was focused on in consultation processes was to make the dialogue better, right? To have better conversations with people. Absolutely. But ultimately, what do we have there? We're still just having conversations, and we're still open to the critique that it's nothing more than just a talk shop, right? We have good conversations, we hear each other, but at the end of the day, nothing really changes. And I think what's happening now, and we see this maybe less so in forestry and more in the energy sector, but I think it's coming to forestry too in some way. What's happening is that meaningful consultation, meaningful public engagement is going to mean, and is starting to mean in many places, some kind of an equity stake, some kind of equity ownership, some kind of ownership in a project. And so when you see that with indigenous communities that want to buy pipelines, right? So they'll say, in order for us to have an equal seat at the table, we need to have an ownership stake, right? And so within the energy sector, you see communities buying into projects, having an equity stake. You see that in renewable energy. That's an area that I'm focusing on more and more these days, is how to connect energy production to community development. And because renewable energy is scalable, you can have one solar panel, or you can have a whole field of them. You can have one wind turbine, or you can have dozens of turbines. Communities can actually get involved in the game. And so community or public engagement in community forestry, or public engagement in forestry, I think has a lot to do with some opportunities for equity ownership. Having a stake in the game. And I don't know what that looks like, because there's so many constraints around, the tenure system in forest management, for example. I don't know how you get communities involved in having an equity ownership, or indigenous communities. But I think that's where the conversation is going in many sectors of our economy.
Absolutely. Well, and I understand if some people in industry would be hesitant to want to start to give up that control, because it's already they would say it's already a tight industry when it comes to, financial well-being. But it's also, I think it's inevitable, right? Like, we're in the age of communication that we're in now. I think forest management, just like everything else, needs to become more transparent if it wants to continue to have social acceptance and social license to operate, right? Because I think that is at risk. We're not seeing it right now here in Alberta so much, but in BC sure as hell is, right? Yeah. Like they're really in the middle of this social license, do what we ask, or we're going to kick your tenure system off the landscape, right? And the truth is, the public has the power to do that. And this is coming from a forester, and I fully believe that the forest industry is sustainable and should and can exist on the landscape in a sustainable way, and does in a lot of ways. But I think when society starts to ask more of us to start to change just the way we think about it, our relationship to it, right? Like, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I'm having more and more of these conversations that are parallel thinking, right? And everyone seems to be having this conversation about how do we move away from managing for timber to managing for everything, and timber being a byproduct of that management, right? I think it's scary for industry, because like you said, the margins are so thin. But I think the faster we can get ahead of it, the more we can start to engage in these opportunities and try things and experiment, like you said. Yeah. I feel like it just puts us further ahead, and it puts the industry in a good position to say, hey, like, we have nothing to hide. We're doing good things. Here's how we might be able to contribute and help. But it takes that ingenuity that we have to start taking chances, like you mentioned earlier. Yeah,
I guess when you talk about just how industry, is needs to change because we have to do sort of a better job of kind of managing for these, multiple values. It makes me think about the whole kind of sustainable forest management approach that got its beginnings in the 1990s with the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. We have this definition of sustainable forest management with these criteria and indicators. And timber, or timber production is one of these indicators of sustainability, but there are many others, sort of biodiversity, kind of water quality. And then there are lots of kind of societal things, and community sustainability was one of them. But don't you think that the industry, partly because of this policy context from the 1990s up to the present, has been focused on sort of managing for multiple values for a long time? Like, is there something different now that? No. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think I absolutely agree. Like, it's in their plans. You know what I mean? They've been focused on. I definitely agree. This is not I don't want to sit here and make it seem like I'm saying industry sucks or anything like that. I'm totally with industry. I think that they're doing good things, right? And they're doing what society has asked of them. And I don't I think the industry can stand up tall and say, no, we're doing the right thing. We're doing what the science says and all that. But I think one of the major arguments that I keep running into with ecologists and foresters and other people is that they want to move away from treating the non-timber values as constraints, right? Like, and so, because right now what we do is we just stay away from the sensitive areas, right? Which is a good approach. It's done us well. It's protected a lot of species. It's kept our waters clean. It's done really good things. And I don't personally think that what has been happening is detrimental or depletive in any sort of way. I think it's done a good job of balancing our relationship to nature, and that, like, hey, we can remove this resource and utilize it in a way that is sustainable, but also without depleting the other resources, right? The argument I'm seeing now from very, environmental or ecologically focused folks is more that there's an opportunity here to not just not deplete other resources, but to actually increase those resources in a way that we want. Like, for example, something like caribou or whatever, caribou habitat right now, I would say that they're not in danger specifically because of the forest industry. They're in danger because of human impact entirely, right? Because of oil and gas, because of agriculture, not agriculture so much, but oil and gas and rural communities and this kind of stuff, and just recreation like quadding and whatever. But the cumulative impact that people have had has caused caribou to have a hard time. And I think forestry has an opportunity, and I think the forest industry would agree, where they can begin to think about those things and provide opportunity to remove timber while also protecting those habitats. And they're already doing stuff like that. But I just think people are starting to ask, not just for sustainability, but for improvement on the landscape and values as well, right? That's kind of how I'm envisioning it, right? And I think some people may listen to some of the conversations I have and think that I'm hard on industry. And that's not my intention. I'm more just interested in learning how can we do better, because we can always do better.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking that, in the context of trying to manage for these multiple values and doing a better job, what does, back to the conversation around indigenous forestry, what would decolonization look like? Mm-hmm. And how would that affect the overall management of forests and the success of forest management planning, the social acceptability, if you want to say, and back to the conversation where maybe, things don't have to be managed a whole lot differently. I mean, we might want to experiment with managing fire in a different way, for example, or managing for values like, country food, right? Managing a food forest, for example. There might be some changes like that, but, there still would be opportunities, obviously a lot of need for economic development through forest management, harvesting, timber production, those kinds of things. But if there were different people in the room who had a stake in the game, right? Not just having nice conversations about what people would like to see on the landscape, but actual people who are a different set of people who have control over the resource, right? Mm-hmm. Could we experiment with that? And if we were successful, would that translate into people being more okay with how the landscape is being managed, because they feel like they had a seat at the table and that they were actually, there and participated meaningfully in the decision-making itself.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the impact that, like, how much harvesting is being done or whatever is too much or anything like that. But I think the opportunities there to have, like you said, to have more people involved, or different stakeholders involved, to the extent that they can say, hey, don't harvest, 5% of what you're planning to harvest here in this specific area because there's moose habitat in there. And if you just avoid that and take the rest of it over here instead, then you still get your harvest levels, but we protect this resource a little more. That's maybe important to indigenous families and that kind of thing. Or maybe it's like, who knows, right? Like, I don't know, there's a million resources on the landscape. So I think you're right. I don't think the actual footprint changes much as we move to a new system. I think it just becomes the planning process may become more complicated, right?
Maybe, yeah.
I'm not sure.
Or just, or people feel like they're in the room not just because they need to be consulted or placated, but because they actually have some control over what's going on. I'm just kind of going back to this idea that, having a stake, like having some kind of equity ownership, whether that looks like a community forest or whether it looks like just an experiment where, a group of stakeholders are invited to participate as equal players in the management of a landscape. That would be an interesting experiment to work on.
It would be. Yeah. And I think there's political pressures to not complicate things and not do things like that. But I think ultimately, I think there is a lot of interest even in industry to do something like that, right? Because like, I think there's opportunity here for like the most important one that I can think of for me is First Nations communities, right? Because they're the most marginalized group of people in the country still today, or at least one of, right? And there's a huge amount of opportunity there to help them build themselves back up in a way that they feel healthy again, and they can rebuild their relationship to land and to community and to nature. And I think most foresters or most land managers see that opportunity, but they don't know the path. They don't know, how do I do this? You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of intention of like, I want to do this. I don't know how to begin, and therefore I'm kind of paralyzed by fear, right? Like, I don't want to screw this up. I want to do this right in a good way. And I think that's a lot of the problem, right? Just paralyzed by the fear of doing something wrong or making it worse somehow, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we're at the university, we're really interested in moving in those directions. There's an effort right now to try and secure funds for a new faculty position in indigenous forestry, and we hope and expect that person would be an indigenous person. And one of the opportunities there is to change the conversation in a way where it's not just you and me, a couple of white guys talking about indigenous forestry, but it's actually indigenous leaders who are driving this conversation forward, and creating the change themselves, right? So that's, I think, a part of the decolonization process. We need indigenous leaders in key positions of leadership. We need indigenous leaders in our industries. We need them in the government. We need them at the university. The university is not ahead in this way. We need to change, and I think we realize that we need to try and make that change, and we're working on it. But other universities are also ahead of us. For example, at UBC, they have a whole indigenous forestry initiative there. We're behind, right? We're behind in Alberta on this front, and I hope this conversation, it makes a small step in that direction in terms of opening up that conversation in Alberta and helping people to see a window, an opportunity to sort of change things here too, right? By putting different kinds of people in the room and looking for those people to continue that conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know if you know, I do another podcast called Good Fire with Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. She's a research. You know Amy? Okay.
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And so we did a series just the first season, and it was all about cultural burning and getting it back on the landscape and the importance of that. We talked a lot about colonial systems and that kind of thing, and we're starting the second season now. And so we've been talking a lot more. And it's something that we interviewed a guy, Byami Williamson, out of Australia, and he's very involved in the cultural burning and indigenous governance and that kind of thing. And they're talking about getting cultural burning back on the landscape, not in a way of, where kind of the Western power structure takes it over and includes it in their management, but in a way that you go, hey, no, we need indigenous leaders to do this kind of thing. And one of the quotes that he said that I really, really thought was interesting was like, we don't need Western society to like bring us in to, show us what they're up to or for them to help us. What we need is for them to listen to us, because we have things to offer that they don't yet know about, right? And I think there's this, because it's indigenous knowledge is not a scientific, traditional scientific, pathway. There's a misunderstanding that they're just lay people that don't know how to relate to the landscape. But the truth is that they have this inherently in themselves because they've been living on this landscape for thousands of years. And there's more and more proof coming out that it's just this, to be blunt, racism, systematic racism in our society that stops us from allowing that to happen, right? The concept of the expert, right? Like, are we experts on fire, or are indigenous people experts on fire? And it's, you know what I mean? So we had this whole conversation about it, and he was basically saying, he's like, listen, like, indigenous people have things to offer, but we're not giving the opportunity to do so, right? And it's not just like, hey, give us a handout so we can do okay. It's like, no. We have ways to contribute that have not yet been realized, and everyone can benefit from this, not just indigenous people, but the entire society. And we just need the opportunity and the freedom to do this kind of stuff, right? And I think that applies to forestry in a big way, in that if we can just stop our fears of, well, what if this, what if that, what if this, what if that, and just meet people, build a relationship, learn to trust them, and say, yeah, you know what, you do that. You do that. Let's see how this goes. Let's test this out. Let's experiment, like you said, very off the top, right? Because I think otherwise, we're just going to be paralyzed by fear and into inaction, and then we just get into a worse situation as time goes on, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you sort of talked about your work with Amy Christensen and sort of indigenous use of fire. I think that's a really neat area for experimentation. But also, I've been reading some really interesting papers in the academic literature on indigenous management of conservation areas, and it showed the data shows worldwide that where indigenous people have more control over these landscapes, there are better ecological values associated with them relative to other landscapes, right? So it's another kind of example of how we've really dismissed the knowledge and the capacity of indigenous people to manage their own affairs, their own landscapes, and there's just more of a push even within Canada for that to happen, in the conservation initiatives, bringing indigenous people back into protected areas management, for example, all throughout Northern Canada, Northwest Territories, new parks that have strong indigenous management imperatives. And, it just feels like, I agree, you're on board with this idea too, just that forestry is there and needs to move into this area in a more meaningful way. And it needs to start making some of those kinds of steps. I think that's the new frontier in many respects. And it speaks to the sort of broader kind of challenge of doing any kind of resource development in Canada. I often say to people, like, you can't do resource development in Canada now on any front without an indigenous, conversation, right? Like a really meaningful one, not just having some discussions and recording the conversation, but actual meaningful engagement with indigenous communities is the basis of all resource development in the country now. So I think forestry is not an exception to that.
No, and don't placate them, like you said, right? Like, I think that's something I run into all the time with some people that I know in First Nations that are the consultation folks there, right? And they say that they often don't do work with organizations because the first time they meet them, they're just being talked down to, right? Because they don't have the pedigree. And it's like, listen, asshole, like, I know what you're talking about. Don't talk down to me because I don't hold the same pedigree as you, right? So there's just a lot of, and I just think that there's just a lot of misunderstanding, right? I think the intentions are there on both sides, or I shouldn't even say both sides, but the intentions are there from all perspectives. It's just, how do we accomplish it? That's getting us into trouble here. But right. I think you're right. I think there's social opportunity there to do do a lot of good socially for these marginalized groups. And the natural resource sector has a huge role to play. And I think it's only getting more true as time goes on, right? And I think it's exciting. I am excited to see these conversations happening so often, especially in industry and not just forest industry, but oil and gas and everything, right? Like there's a lot more of this happening.
Right.
And to speak to First Nations, I'm sure they'd say there's a long ways to go. But I am excited the fact that there seems to be consensus that we're moving in this direction, right? It's exciting to see that. So, well, yeah, this is awesome, John. I appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk environmental sociology. It was, like I said, this is the first one I think I went into without much of a plan, but this was a really good, interesting conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time. So,
yeah, thanks. Yeah, the hour went by really quickly. So, appreciate your questions, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in some other way in the months ahead. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, and there'll be opportunity, I think, to do this again, maybe sometime with other. I'm always open. Always want to talk more about this kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, like you said, two white guys talking about consultation, probably not the most informed thing to do, but it's interesting, right? So
yeah, at least it's a start.
yeah, exactly. So awesome. Well, thanks a lot, John. I appreciate it. Is there anything you want to push people towards? Any resources of yours that you maybe want to put out there for people to access?
Nothing comes to mind right away. Like, I've done some stuff with David Anderson in the last few years around ecosystem-based management, and we had public dialogue sessions on it, and we wrote up a report that I think is kind of interesting, but just speaks to the challenge of defining a concept like EBM and what it means. And I think it's hard to make progress on EBM because there are so many competing perspectives. And, Anderson has a very clear view of what ecosystem-based management is, but that's not the case for a lot of other people in the forest sector. And then stakeholders also have different views. So that whole dialogue and the report that we generated out of that research really highlights that issue quite clearly. So that would be one document. It's on the Healthy Landscapes website with FRIA. With forestry, FRI research. Yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure to add a link in there to that. So what is it called? What's the document called itself? Do you know, or can you send me a link maybe?
Yeah, I can send you a link. Yeah,
okay.
I haven't looked at it for a while.
Okay, and I'll preface it in the introduction or in the outro there, so it's there. So awesome. Thanks, man. Well, that was perfect. I'm gonna stop recording here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Please shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you with any questions, concerns you have. And make sure to share this, rate and review it, share it on social media, tell your friends, your family, whoever might be interested. I want as many people to know about it as possible, so I appreciate your help. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you next time. Take it easy.